Welcome to another Smart Keyway Musings, and we are back to the Friday edition. And this is about skilling. More to look at, news about why is it kind of hard to become skilled, or why is it perceivably hard. Some ideas, some views on what makes skilling and testing possibly different. First, of course, one can always ask, is it really different? We'll take a look at it. I'm just going to muse and probably share about some interesting ideas in this area. Testing probably is an interesting discipline because it's probably more lived, meaning we experience it, we play, we live it. Kind of sometimes harder to articulate it. That's what it seems like. And that's really what I want to muse about. And therefore, it is not about a particular skill or a particular discipline or a set of knowledge in a particular area. That probably is enough for what we do as assurance, testing, quality at large, and so on. So it's one of the disciplines, as I mentioned, probably where we live it. It's kind of harder to explain. That's what it seems to be. And as we mature, we find that we're probably looking at a very multidisciplinary approach, and we struggle to kind of look at it from various angles and articulate those various angles and how they connect. Maybe that's what makes it interesting. So it is not about just technology, it is not about testing, it is not just about a domain, it's about people, it's about business, it's, various different planes. And all of them in some sense weaving together and obviously constrained by our time that we have. And that's really what it is. So how does one build up skills in a discipline that is a lot more expansive, at the same time possibly depth-oriented, but it is very multidisciplinary, multidimensional, and that's probably what the fun part of it is. There isn't a particular center of gravity. There isn't probably a single center of gravity. What do we mean? Maybe if I were to develop, then maybe I would have some specific skills that I could possibly look at, sharpen, deepen in the area of maybe technology, languages, algorithms, and so on. Things which are related to the notion of construction. If I were probably an analyst, a business analyst, then maybe I would look at it from the application domain, the business where the application lives, and how to put it together as a good document, express the ideas, and so on. So there seems to be, when you look at some other roles in the typical software engineering arena, it seems to be where I can look at certain specific knowledge and skill areas and probably go into it a little more deeper and maybe feel more comfortable about doing it. So maybe as a developer, probably if I'm seriously sharp about technical skills, I'll still be able to do a pretty decent job despite my lack of decent social skills. I'm not saying they are not required. I'm just saying that certain depth, certain focus seems to be there with other disciplines. But when it comes to probably the notion of looking at it from a perspective of assurance, validation, testing at large, we seem to kind of broad base that, right? It doesn't seem like there's a particular skill that I can go with. And that's probably what is interesting. That every other role seems to have some kind of a center of gravity, whereas we seem to have less, and other roles seemingly are a little more sharpened and clearer, whereas testing is seemingly broader and makes it, in some sense, possibly harder. Right? So for those kinds of skills which are very reasonably sharp, I can outline, maybe as, here is a particular concept that I want to know. There is some example, I practice, and I probably get good in it. So maybe I want to learn something about algorithms, be able to express it in a particular language, be able to justify it within certain patterns. So maybe I have 3 sets of pieces where I can look at concepts related to algorithms, concepts related to programming and design and code, and concepts related to patterns and so on and so forth. I can read, I can probably see some examples, I can practice. It seems like a reasonably linear fashion, like, left to right. Seems to be a cleaner arc. Now, if I look at it here, yeah, you can read, but then when I actually get into the act of doing, maybe when I'm reviewing a spec, maybe I'm exploring a product, I'm validating a feature or a flow, and I'm looking at it from various different angles and maybe looking at defects and stuff like that. It's a very funny thing. It's not textbook stuff, right? So we kind of experience, do this act, maybe see some discomfort. I don't know what happens, what should it happen, see an interesting issue, look forward, looking for areas which I don't know, which could be rocky, but then I have to kind of go through, question, connect it to certain concepts, maybe interpret it or reinterpret it, and it seems to be like one twisted path, kind of goes round and round, right? So it's not like you can say, okay, here is a technique, here is a template, just follow it. We know it doesn't, that doesn't completely go forward. So if you kind of look at the arc of learning and teaching the way I would do it with respect to, let's say, some other skills compared to testing, poses some kind of an interesting problem or some kind of an interesting challenge. So all I wanted to kind of highlight here as and muse about it is there's probably a bit of an inversion. It's not a very linear process, right? It seems to be a lot of, it seems to come back. It's not a straight arrow. The arrow's in some sense, circling, looping. Right? We all use this word every day, context. Right? We say that testing is not just, it's not unidimensional. We just don't stick in an arrow path. It's not a one-lane thing. You need the larger context. And somehow this is a word that's fairly popular. We use it every day. What the heck does that mean? Seemingly, because we seem to say, hey, there is no well-bounded piece, there is no boundaries. You look at technology, you need to understand what system is made of, you need to understand the application and the role in the business, you need to understand what's at stake, who are the users, what do they do, how much do they do, what is the value, etc. It reaches in the domain, people, process aspects. So there is a whole bunch of variety of things, and we kind of jumble up all of that and kind of give it the idea of context. So it's a nice label. Something that we will find it interesting to unpack. Right? So what does it really mean? Probably it's not just a simple word. It's, I don't know, maybe a discipline of maybe who, why, where, when, what pressure, what stakes, what is said, what is not said. A variety of these put together may give you the underlying notion of a context, right? The state of the system, the state of the user, and so on and so forth. So I don't know what to call it. Maybe it's not just a simple word. It's a very interesting word, probably complex enough. And I think all of us, when we mature, find it far more interesting, far more difficult, very harder to define most of the time, right? So it could be who uses the product, why was it built, when is it used, what are the pressures, is there any regulatory compliance, competitive stuff that is there, what is the history, what failed before, what can be learned from past, what are stakes in terms of money, reputation, human, what are various expectations, And critically, of course, is the context is also about things that are not said, things that are not stated, things that are hidden. And not everything, quite obviously, can be documented the way it is. So it's a kind of very active, ongoing practice of understanding. Trying to establish, in some sense, the potential reality of the product. Right? And it is not something that you're given that easily. It's something that you kind of build. And you say it depends on context. It's like say, hey, there are many, many planes to look at, many, many dimensions to look at maybe. And that's a very critical reframe. That, it is not something that you said, here is the context and poof, I've given you everything. I probably might give you a few or somebody would give us a few, but nobody hands it over in a simple document or a simple briefing. You can't really say I've got the whole context, right? You kind of build it plane by plane, skill by skill, something like that. Through an active engagement of probing, listening, questioning, experimenting, and so on. The more the angles that you see, which I'm calling as planes, simultaneously, the richer the context seems to be. So when somebody says, it depends on context, what I probably think they mean is, it depends on how many viewpoints, how many planes you're able to see at once, simultaneously. So if I'm a tester with a bit of a narrow set, a narrow skill set, then my context is probably seen only from or a few planes and maybe therefore a bit narrow. Whereas if I'm operating across multiple planes, maybe I see a larger, fuller reality. And therefore that's where it matters, where we move from a bit of a shallow kind of a test to a far more deeper test. And we all know the more deep we go into, the more interesting it becomes because we kind of figure out that we don't know as much, right? And that's probably the reality itself. And that's what makes it interesting. And that's why probably this entire discipline is in some sense interesting, misunderstood, thought of it as easy because it's a lot more hidden, and so on and so on. So a deep testing probably is, I'm quite sure most of us would probably connect with this, that it's not a single skill. It's not about I just know testing stuff or engineering stuff or process stuff or domain stuff. It seems to look at it that way. Right? It's probably not a single skill. It's probably a constellation of many planes, many things, and somehow they meaningfully connect. Right? It's a variety of different skills operating on different planes, and it kind of, we can probably simplify it for a purposes of, in this case, muse about and probably dig into it as some kind of 4 phases, which is what I want to talk. But it's many planes, and I'm quite sure each of us can come up with different names to illustrate it. So it could be like, understanding what to probe could be one set, or a phase set, whatever you may want to call it. How to probe, the cognitive and the representational skills could be another box or another set of planes. The act of probing, the act of evaluation, the craft of testing, the doing, could be another box, a set of planes. And how to make that insight and how to communicate that insight through expression, dealing with humans, could probably be another box of skills or another set. And that's what I want to kind of muse about and then take it forward and then look at, now that we have got companions in terms of AI, where does it look? And that's where we'll probably end with. So this is a particular view, right? There can be many views. I'm sure each one of you is, deep enough to be able to appreciate and come up with their own set. But this is what I probably would like to muse about. So I'm going to look at it as kind of 4 sets, maybe across maybe 4 phases, if you will, or 4 sets, if whatever is the right word. One is about the elements. Because at the end of the day, we are constantly, when we look at the act of validation, and we look at assurance as a word, quality as a larger word, and so on, it's always about trying to understand the needs, the expectations, the value, and what we are delivering, and so on and so forth. So initially I want to look at it simply from the elements. Maybe the first phase is about, the elements of technology, to be able to understand what are the composition of the system, what are elements that make up of it, language, structure, algorithm, data, models, patterns, whatever, right? And that is probably more from the technology pillar. So that's one kind of a plane. The domain where the product kind of serves, more from the domain of application. You might call it whatever you want. You might say healthcare, you might say manufacturing, you might say e-commerce, whatever application domain of interest. And largely the other context is from the business. Business as in terms of what it means to the business, the stakeholders in the business, value, risk, return of investment, reality of the market, compliance, and so on and so forth. So in a way, it's like these three planes form a kind of a basic foundation for me to be able to appreciate and understand what am I trying to do, what is intended, what is planned, what are the elements that go into the product, and maybe get a better appreciation of how we can go forward in terms of the next set of planes, in terms of how do I probe and how do I make sense out of it, and so on and so forth. So this is like one set, one phase, whatever you may want to call it, which is made up of, in some sense, the three planes of technology, domain, and business. Now that I probably attempted to kind of figure out, if you will, or in some sense say, okay, these are elements that I probably need to have, so I need to have knowledge and skills to be able to understand. So I need to actually go through and probe, and therefore it's a larger notion of thinking and representation. Right? So it's more like the passive knowledge that I had acquired, so to speak, with some of the skills that we just briefly touched upon in terms of domain, technology, and business. We're trying to convert it into an active set. Various forms of thinking, system thinking, critical thinking, lateral thinking, whatever, creative thinking, etc., etc. Where we're driving through with an intellectual piece, coupled with skepticism, creativity, heuristics that we have built from ourselves and others. All these are, in some sense, converting that passive knowledge into an active ingredient, and ultimately we use those various instruments of thinking to power, to be able to probe, to be able to question, to be able to appreciate, to be able to connect. But then, as I am thinking, it's not just about just thinking and let it go. I am connecting, I am representing it. So I have a skill of modeling, visualizing, abstracting, and so on. So as I am navigating the whole piece, I am connecting these various pieces, and therefore trying to control, I wouldn't say control, maybe holding the complexity of a large system and its larger context in the mind's eye, so that I can navigate the unseen. Which is not, you're not just thinking about the system, right? You're thinking about the system and you're building a picture of it, and that picture in a way guides whatever else that you do. So maybe there is, for lack of any better word, two planes here, which is probing to understand. Now, obviously, I have to do something meaningful with it, and that's what I'm trying to do. So now that I'm kind of looked at the skills that are required for elemental pieces of understanding, the ability to go and make it active, I obviously get into the, in a way, phase of evaluation, so to speak, which is obviously probing, but the intent shifts from not just understanding and stuff like that, but to actual notion of evaluation. So that's where probably things related to assurance of techniques and strategies and design and all that stuff that is the, so to speak, the book of skills and knowledge that comes in from testing per se, come into picture along with certain practices, processes that comes along. And that's really the evaluation part, right? Process, practice, setting up infrastructure, crafting the data, active execution, measuring something, observation. All those things probably broadly spaced out into these two planes of assurance and evaluation under the phase of probing to evaluate. Then finally comes, in some sense, maybe some planes that are probably important, knowledges and skills related to these of I am, as I'm evaluating, finding some stuff, maybe finding issues, finding anomalies, coming up with suggestions, stuff like that. So I need to be able to express meaningfully to whomsoever. So, it's not just about writing a bug report, right? It is about probably seeing, creating insights as we go, expressing not just mere documentation, conveying meaningfully and seeking insights from what I have. So one part is expression, making what you found matter to the rest of the folks. The first kind of plane, right? But it is not just about expressing it. It's about communicating it meaningfully so the other person probably is able to see some insight. So I have to understand that I'm dealing with people. So human plane is more about, and I'm sure we all appreciate, empathy, listening, trust, awareness, adaptability, and so on. And empathy at an individual level is the human plane, so to speak. And the larger context of social, if I look at it as individual anthropology is like human aspect and sociology is the social plane that I'm talking about. Team dynamics, organizational behavior, politics, power, hierarchy, filtering of information, egos, all that probably come into the human elements of human and social at an individual and a collective. In a way, at this point in time is when probably the act of testing meets reality checks, because we're dealing with humans who make decisions, who appreciate what we do or don't appreciate what we do, and don't see value in what we do or see value in what we do. So it's these 4 sets or 4 phases and these kind of 10 planes probably is one way to look at the knowledge and the skills. And then how does one expand along, in this case, these 10 planes that are outlined, and how does therefore one mature? Right? Or more importantly, in a slightly different sense, if I'm having a younger person in the team, so to speak, how do I convey this idea and therefore help the person blossom along these 4 phases in these 10 planes? Now you might view this 10 planes in a slightly different manner. You might add a few more. That's perfectly okay. This is not a pedagogy where you say, hey, here is the 10 ways of doing things. This is just an interesting thought of how to put it. So having kind of outlined or mused about the idea that, maybe it's these various planes, how does one skill? It's not like you say, okay, I'm going to learn this today, I'm going to try this, I'm going to go into this plane and become good at it. And no, I don't think it's just about a particular stuff, right? A particular set of knowledge in a particular plane at a particular phase. They're not steps. They're not, a staircase. They don't follow a particular sequence. We oscillate. That means, the knowledge that I have across, they connect. So I go here, I come back. I connect this. So it's kind of a constant sense of oscillation, not necessarily steps. And there is probably a friction because all these things are not like so beautifully connected. So when I do this, I may have said something else. So I guess we appreciate that. So we always say, oh, you can do this, but then does it pose a risk? So if it's not risky, why bother? And so on and so forth. Right? So it helps us to revise our understanding constantly. The concepts seem to land, but then there is a constant friction. And in the process of understanding, we change, we morph. And as we kind of go digger and digger, it's not necessarily always about certainty. It creates a lot more ambiguity because it's not necessarily perfectly clear. And so the judgment itself that we make on things, it's not always about I am certain about it, so therefore I can judge. It's also from the fact that lots of times I'm still struggling. It's kind of ambiguous. The context is never kind of complete. It deepens with every pass in the constellation, right? So every test, every conversation, every failure adds in, if you will. as we go forward. So you can't just go and say, here is risk-based testing and put it as a concept. It's kind of hard. And certainly we know when we use terms like exploratory testing or any of these words, they are a fairly rich set of concepts. It's not just a particular linear piece, which I'm sure we all appreciate. So certainly it's not a linear path, and that's what probably makes it more difficult, because it's not like what we talked about earlier, a left to right. And that's interesting. So if you play the role of a teacher, a mentor, or a coach, or whatever, it's probably more interesting when they are trying to groom testers, and all of you might have gone through the piece. You're not just a distributor of content. You're not just saying, okay, I'm going to teach you. That's probably one part, but that's not the part. It's really about how one as a teacher become more of a guide to be able to help see the attention across the planes. Help the learner see where to look, not just to find. And therefore, as a teacher, I'm more probably a designer of such experiences that honors this complexity. And therefore, skilling is not about delivering answers. It's about cultivating the notion of perception, judgment, question, courage to search, and so on and so forth. And that's what, ultimately lends into a more meaningful probing exercise. And so, the role of a person who's playing the role of a teacher is probably different when we look at it from this angle, and that's what makes it more interesting. And so we say, okay, what do you mean by mature? What does it mean to say, okay, an experienced mature tester? Is it a particular skill? I guess we know it's not. So that's why I guess we're always torn within whenever somebody says I'm, human tester or manual tester and I'm automated tester, we all kind of, it makes us cringe. Simply because maturity is a multi-dimensional expansion. It's not about years of experience, it's not about seniority, it's not about certifications, all that stuff, right? It's about how many planes a tester can see simultaneously, engage with, and operate upon. So, being strong in technology, assurance, evaluation, etc., rests quite differently, tests very differently from one who understands the domain, business, thinking, representation, and so on. So in a way, the early tester finds defects. The next level tester probably finds what matters. And as we extend across each plane, our testing maturity rises, because that gives us something concrete to look at skilling not as a checklist, but as a landscape of kind of growth. Right? So maybe all these planes, as we go, so to speak, whether it's 3 or 8, I guess we start looking at not just defects, we ultimately find what matters. Maybe it's a defect, maybe it's an interesting idea, maybe it's a suggestion, maybe it's an interesting critique, whatever. So it's not just about saying, hey, I find defects. So maybe as a path of a career in terms of a growth, not in terms of a role or a designation, it's like, initially I might probably have to start off somewhere, so I'll probably focus on technology aspects, assurance aspects, evaluation aspects, and as I grow, probably the various ways of thinking, the various ways of representation, the more depth in terms of a domain, the way I communicate, express, thoughts, ideas, and whatever. And as I mature, I will understand it. It transgresses beyond the product and what the process and so on. It is because I will look at it from the larger context of human, business, and the community at large. And when you say I'm a deep tester, I guess, we are able to somehow connect all of them in some sense and probably try to grab, move across all these planes. That's probably what is higher order thinking. And we find that becomes limitless because there is no real end that we can actually see. And so before I close down, maybe should probably take a minute, now we've got this AI business. Where does that come in? How does that help? What's its role? The real question is, where does it assist in this constellation? Is it a better doer in some sense? So I don't need to have certain knowledge. I can replace those pieces. I don't have to waste my time. Or is it an amplifier? Or does it shift? It gives me a differentiation to shift where I cannot reach, right? Certainly, the interesting part about AI, the way we use it, is it probably can assist us across all these planes. It accelerates acquisition of knowledge. You can summarize regulations, explain technology, surface context. Certainly amplifies execution. It may generate script, data, test, scripts, etc. It supports better representation, can model, visualize, diagram, help us in all that stuff. But there is probably, we all know, that the notion of curiosity cannot be casually automated, right? Skepticism cannot be automated. Instinct cannot be automated, and so on and so forth, because there are probably more interestingly human qualities, and therefore co-working stuff would be useful, right? So if I can look at probably AI, which I'm sure all of us see this in various ways, practice it in different ways, it makes technical planes more accessible, and it acts as a, the differentiator for a deep tester, shifts towards planes where AI cannot reach out, but helps you to possibly to dig in, to figure out questions, to analyze, and so on. So that's probably where it reaches, right? So I'll leave you with this last question. This is not really, it's not that I want an answer, but it's just for us to reflect on. And the question is, what would skilling look like if we truly honored this breadth, this depth, this larger notion of human reality? So if context is built through a constellation of skills across these 10 planes that we mused about as domain, business, technology, thinking, etc., what would it look? If it truly honored that, how would it become? What would skills be? I don't know the answer per se, but I thought it would be an interesting question. And this is to just put that in place as a constellation here. That, we probably have 3 of those planes, domain, technology, and the first elements of understanding and so on. And then the probing to understand, probing to evaluate, having those 4. And the last one, which is, how I communicate to others, the ability to express ideas, suggestions, lead, etc., and the human connection. So thank you.